In 22 years of hosting The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson apologized to a guest on live television exactly once. Not in the green room, not during a commercial break, not in a quiet phone call the following morning. On air, with the cameras rolling, the studio lights burning, and 5 million Americans watching from their living rooms with no idea what they were about to witness. The date was March 14th, 1984. The guest was Paul McCartney. For a moment, no one in that studio moved. The 342 people in the audience made a sound that was not applause. Something quieter, more involuntary. The noise a room produces when something true has just entered a space built entirely for performance. The producers in the control room looked up from their clipboards at the same instant. The house band went completely still. Nobody had seen this coming. Not the stage manager who had worked 11 years at NBC. Not the senior producer with 14 years of tapings behind her. Not Paul McCartney himself, who had arrived that night expecting a standard 7-minute interview about his new album, and had walked, without warning, into something none of them had prepared for. But here is what nobody tells you about that night. The apology was not the most remarkable thing that happened on that stage. The most remarkable thing happened 11 minutes earlier. In the near darkness of the wings, behind the curtain at stage left, where Paul McCartney stood completely alone with a borrowed guitar and played something he had never recorded, never released, and never played again. When he carried that guitar out onto the stage moments later, something shifted in that room that the people who witnessed it have never fully been able to explain. This is the story of those 11 minutes. If you have ever been reduced to a punchline by someone with a microphone and a room full of people laughing along, subscribe right now and stay with this story. Because what Paul McCartney did in those 11 minutes is one of the most quietly devastating things ever captured on live television. But first, you need to understand exactly what Johnny Carson said into that microphone. 8 words, delivered with a 4-second pause in precisely the right place. And Paul McCartney, standing alone behind that curtain in the wings, heard every single one. By March of 1984, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was not simply a television program, it was a verdict. Carson had occupied that desk since 1962, 22 years, and in that time, he had transformed late-night television into something that functioned less like entertainment and more like a nightly referendum on who mattered in American culture. If Carson laughed with you, the country laughed with you. If Carson reduced you, in 8 words, with a pause calibrated to land in exactly the right place, 5 million people absorbed that reduction simultaneously. And it had a way of attaching itself to your public image in a manner that was genuinely difficult to undo. Carson's writers understood the weight of the platform. Carson understood it better than anyone. He was not a careless man. He was a precise one. And precision on a stage that powerful could cut in directions nobody intended. Paul McCartney arrived at NBC Burbank at 9:40 that evening, in reasonably good spirits. He had been doing television interviews for 20 years and approached them with the professional calm of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the format. The booking had taken 10 days to arrange. His team had submitted conditions. No questions about John Lennon, no archival Beatles footage played without prior approval, no surprises in the rundown. The Tonight Show's production team had agreed to all of it. Nobody thought to discuss the monologue. Nobody ever thought to discuss the monologue. What nobody said out loud, not in the negotiations, not in the green room, not in any of the polite professional exchanges that surrounded the booking, was what the cultural conversation around Paul McCartney actually looked like in early 1984. The Beatles had dissolved 14 years earlier. Wings had quietly disbanded in 1981 without a farewell tour or a final statement. His latest album had performed respectably and generated the kind of reviews that deployed words like warm and melodic and accessible, words that aimed at the man who co-wrote Yesterday, Blackbird, and Let It Be, carried the specific sting of a compliment designed to diminish. The reputation that had calcified around Paul McCartney by that point was suffocating in its precision. He was the Beatle who had survived by making himself comfortable, the one who wanted to be liked, the one who never threatened anyone. That was the version of Paul McCartney that lived in the cultural imagination on March 14, 1984. And in 11 minutes, Johnny Carson was going to say it out loud, into a live microphone, in front of 342 people, without knowing that the man it described was standing 12 feet away behind a curtain, listening to every word. What Carson said lasted 4 seconds. When it set in motion, lasted the rest of the night. And Paul McCartney, standing in the dark of those wings, was already deciding exactly how he was going to answer. Paul left the green room at 11:03 and made his way to the wings at stage left. This was not unusual for him. He had a habit, one his production team knew well, of watching a show from the wings rather than waiting in the green room, preferring to read the temperature of a room before walking into it. He told the stage manager on duty, a woman named Carol Reeves, who had worked NBC tapings for 11 years, that he wanted to watch from stage left. Carol had accommodated this kind of request 100 times. She showed him to his position behind the curtain and returned to her post. Paul stood with his arms folded and watched Johnny Carson work the monologue from 12 feet away, separated from the stage by a single curtain and 11 years of television mythology. He watched with the specific appreciation of one craftsman observing another at full capacity. Carson was extraordinary live, economical, precise, operating on rhythms so finely calibrated they were nearly invisible unless you had spent enough years studying how an audience breathes to recognize them. Paul, who had spent 30 years understanding exactly how a room full of people responds to sound, watched Carson the way one professional watches another professional doing something difficult and making it look effortless. 17 minutes into the monologue, Carson transitioned to the evening's guests. He mentioned Paul McCartney. He acknowledged the Beatles. He acknowledged Wings. He paused, the specific pause of a man who has spent 22 years understanding precisely where the beat of a laugh lives inside a sentence. And then, with the casual, devastating precision of someone who had been doing this since 1962, he said it. 8 words, delivered cleanly, without malice, without hesitation, the way a surgeon makes an incision, not cruelly, but efficiently. The only Beatle who survived by never threatening anyone. 4 seconds. The audience laughed. The band played a sting. Carson moved to the next item on his card. Carol Reeves was standing 2 feet from Paul McCartney when those 8 words came through the curtain. She watched his face with the professional attention of a woman who had spent 11 years managing live television and knew how to read a room's energy in a single glance. Paul did not flinch. He did not react with the quick flash of anger that would have been completely understandable and completely visible. What moved across his face was slower than that, quieter. Carol would describe it years later as the expression of a man who has just been told something he already knew the entire world was thinking, and has finally decided he is done letting it go uncorrected. Paul unfolded his arms. He turned to Carol. He said, quietly and without any particular emphasis, "Is there a guitar anywhere back here?" Carol looked at him. She had worked 11 years of live television. She had managed hundreds of tapings, hundreds of guests, hundreds of unscheduled requests in the wings of The Tonight Show. She had never had a guest ask for a guitar 12 minutes before their curtain call. She got him one. Subscribe right now if you are still with this story. Because what Paul McCartney does with that guitar in the next 4 minutes has never been told this completely. And the people who watched it from 3 feet away never forgot what they saw. But what Paul plays in those wings Quietly, alone, with Carol watching, and two crew members frozen in place without fully understanding why they have stopped moving, is not Yesterday. It is not Let It Be. It is not any song Paul McCartney has ever recorded. And that is the detail that the house band musicians talked about for the rest of the night. The guitar Carol Reeves produced was a Martin D28 acoustic, one of 3 instruments the house kept in a case near the stage-left prop bay for exactly these kinds of unscheduled moments. She handed it to Paul at 11:09 p.m. He took it without ceremony, the way a carpenter picks up a hammer, not with reverence, not with performance, but with the quiet familiarity of a man who has been holding this particular tool since he was 14 years old. He sat down on a folding equipment case, rested the guitar across his knee, and began. What followed was not a warm-up. 2 crew members working the stage-left cable run that night, a gaffer named Thomas Briggs and a camera cable operator named Donna Melcher, both stopped what they were doing within 30 seconds and did not start again. They would describe it afterward in language so similar it was almost unsettling. Thomas Briggs said, "It wasn't practicing. It was like watching someone have a conversation with something that wasn't in the room." Donna Melcher said, "He wasn't warming up. He was searching. And whatever he was looking for, you could feel the moment he found it." Paul moved through chord sequences that did not resolve, melodic fragments that arrived and turned back, passages that sounded simultaneously like Delta blues and English hymns, and something with no name and no country of origin at all. Carol stood 3 feet away and felt the specific sensation of watching someone think in a language she did not speak, but could somehow feel in her chest. At one point, Paul stopped completely. 12 seconds of total silence in the wings of The Tonight Show. Then he played 6 notes, slowly, with enormous deliberateness, and Carol said later that the hair on her arms stood up before she consciously understood why. He had found it. He played it once more, quietly, just to be certain. Then he set the guitar across his knee and went still. Johnny Carson introduced Paul McCartney at 11:21 p.m. The curtain opened. Paul walked out carrying the guitar. The format, walk out, sit at the desk, exchange pleasantries, talk, did not include a guitar. Carson's face performed the micro-recalibration of a man who has absorbed 22 years of live television surprises and trained himself to convert shock into composure in under a second. The studio audience stirred with the collected instinct of people who sense, without being told, that something unscripted is about to happen. Paul nodded at the guest chair. He did not sit. He looked at Carson, then at the audience. Then he said with complete pleasantness and zero performance, "Before we talk, do you mind if I play something first?" Carson said, "Please." What Paul McCartney played on that stage lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. It was not Yesterday. It was not Let It Be. It was not Blackbird or Hey Jude or any composition those 342 people had ever heard before. It was the thing he had found in the wings, that rootless, borderless piece of music that moved through blues and folk and something almost devotional and refused every attempt to categorize it. The house band musicians, 7 professionals who had spent a combined 43 years accompanying guests on that stage, went involuntarily still within the first 30 seconds. The band leader, Raymond Cole, who had directed the ensemble since 1979, would say afterward that he had stopped conducting without realizing it. He had simply forgotten he was working. The studio audience did not applaud during the performance, not because they had been instructed not to, because they had forgotten to. They were doing the thing that only the rarest live music ever produces. They were not watching a performance from the outside. They were inside one, and the boundary between the sound and themselves had quietly dissolved. Paul finished. He lowered the guitar. He did not look at the audience. He looked at the guitar for a moment, the way a craftsman looks at a tool after a job completed exactly right. Then he looked at Carson. Carson did not speak. 5 seconds passed, visible in the broadcast tape if you know precisely where to look, sitting between the final note and the first word, like the space between an exhaled breath and the decision to speak. In those 5 seconds, in front of 342 people in that studio and 5 million watching at home, Johnny Carson made a decision that he had not made once in 22 years of live television. He said, "I owe you an apology." The studio filled with a sound that was not ordinary applause. It was the noise a room makes when something true and unrehearsed has been said out loud in a space built entirely for the managed and the scripted. The house band played a sting. Carson gestured toward the guest chair. This time, Paul sat. What happened in the 19 minutes that followed was something the producers in the control room had never seen Carson do, and would never see him do again. The clock on the wall said one thing. Nobody in that room was listening to the clock. The standard guest slot on The Tonight Show was 7 minutes. Every producer in that control room knew it, tracked it, and enforced it, with the particular anxiety of live television professionals who understood that running long had consequences that cascaded through everything that followed. The senior producer on duty that night was a woman named Elaine Forsythe, 14 years at NBC, who had interrupted guest segments for smaller infractions without hesitation and without apology. She watched the clock at 11:29 p.m. tick past the 7-minute mark. She did not pick up the intercom. She did not signal the floor. There are moments in live television, she would say years later, when the clock simply stops applying. This was one of them. Carson did not use his cards. This was the detail that Elaine Forsythe noted in the production log that night. Not because it was policy to note it, but because in 14 years of tapings she had seen it happen twice, and both times something significant had occurred on that stage. Carson worked from cards, every guest, every topic, every follow-up question, prepared, indexed, reviewed before airtime. That night, for 19 minutes, he set them face down on the desk and did not look at them once. He asked Paul about the music. Not the album, not Wings, not the Beatles catalog or the royalties dispute, or any of the approved topics his team had cleared in advance. He asked about the piece Paul had played, where it had come from, what it was, whether it existed anywhere outside of those 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Paul said it didn't have a name. He talked about the musical education he had conducted as a teenager in Liverpool. American blues records smuggled over by merchant sailors. Country music absorbed from import albums that cost more than his weekly allowance. Gospel traditions learned entirely by ear from recordings and nothing else. He talked about music the way he only ever talked about music when he wasn't managing how he sounded talking about it. Directly, without architecture, almost incidentally, the way people describe things they love when they have briefly forgotten that anyone is listening. Carson asked 3 follow-up questions that were not on his card. The producers noted this because it almost never happened. That night, it happened 3 times. After the taping, the house band convened in the green room corridor for what Raymond Cole called the 30-second honest assessment, the informal debrief that followed every show. On the night of March 14th, Raymond Cole said nothing for the first 5 minutes. Then he said, "I want to know what those 6 notes were. The ones he played before he walked out. I want to know what he was looking for and how he knew the moment he found it." Nobody answered. There was no answer to give. Carol Reeves drove home at 1:15 a.m. and did not sleep well, not from distress, but from the specific restlessness that follows witnessing something that permanently recalibrates your understanding of what is possible inside a single room. Paul McCartney left NBC Burbank at 12:50. He did not debrief with his publicist. He got into the car. According to his driver, he said nothing for the first 8 minutes. Then, he asked for the radio. The driver turned it on. Paul listened to whatever was playing and said nothing further. His driver would describe this later as completely unremarkable. Paul had always processed a good night exactly the same way he processed everything else, by listening to more music. If this story is doing something to you right now, that feeling is not an accident. Like this, share it and stay with us, because the next part is the part nobody ever talks about, and it is the part that explains everything. The March 14th, 1984 broadcast has never appeared in any official Carson retrospective. It has never been included in an anniversary compilation or a best-of collection. It exists in the NBC archive and in the memories of the people who were inside that studio. And when Paul McCartney was asked about it 3 years later, his answer was so simple and so complete that the interviewer did not ask another question for the rest of the conversation. Carson's 8 words were not malicious. That matters enormously, and the story only works if you understand it clearly. He was not being cruel. He was not settling a score or delivering a verdict with intent to wound. He was being efficient, the way a comedian is efficient when he reaches for the version of a public figure that the audience already holds, because the audience's recognition is precisely where the laugh lives. The safe Beatle, the comfortable one, the one who survived by never threatening anyone. That compressed, convenient, quietly devastating summary of Paul McCartney had been forming in the cultural imagination for years before March 14, 1984. Carson had not invented it. He had simply said it out loud, in 8 words, in front of 5 million people, with the timing of a man who had spent 22 years understanding exactly how much damage a well-placed pause could do. Paul McCartney walked out onto that stage with a borrowed guitar and replaced that version with something more accurate. He did it without a speech, without a defense, without anger or irony or the kind of careful public dignity that reads, to everyone watching, as wounded. He did it with 4 minutes and 12 seconds of music that said, more completely than any sentence could, exactly who he was, where he had come from, and what 30 years of serious, wide-ranging, disciplined musical work actually sounded like, when you stripped away every assumption and every lazy headline, and every review that had ever used the word safe, as though it were a compliment. Johnny Carson said, "I owe you an apology," and meant it. You could hear that he meant it. The audience could hear it. The 5 million people watching at home could hear it. And in 22 years of live television, through presidents and legends and cultural icons of every possible variety, he had not said those words to a guest. Not once. Not before that night. Not after it. Paul McCartney was asked about that evening in a 1987 interview. The journalist asked directly, had he walked out with that guitar specifically because of what Carson said? Paul considered the question for a long moment. What he said next stopped the interview completely. When the interviewer asked Paul McCartney in 1987 whether he had walked out onto that stage with a guitar specifically because of what Carson said, Paul considered the question with the full seriousness it deserved. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man who does not reach for the nearest answer when a more accurate one is available. Then he said, "I had something true to say. I just wanted to say it in the right language." The interviewer did not ask a follow-up question. There was no follow-up question to ask. The March 14th, 1984 broadcast exists in the NBC archive. The 8 words are there. The borrowed Martin D28 is there. The 4 minutes and 12 seconds are there. The 5 seconds of silence between the final note and Carson's apology are there. Visible in the tape if you know precisely where to look. Sitting between the last sound Paul made and the first word Johnny spoke. Like the space between a question and the answer that makes the question unnecessary. There is a version of every person that the world constructs without their permission. A compressed, convenient, assumption-built version that travels faster than the truth and lands harder than anything they have actually done. Paul McCartney did not argue with that version. He did not explain it, defend it, or negotiate with it. He walked onto a stage with a borrowed guitar and simply played until it was no longer possible to hold. Johnny Carson said, "I owe you an apology." He meant every word, and 5 million people heard exactly why. If this story stayed with you, if those 11 minutes reminded you that the most powerful answer to being underestimated is to show up and let your work speak louder than anyone else's opinion of it, subscribe, ring the bell, and share this right now with someone who needs to hear it. The archive exists. The 5 seconds of silence exists. And Paul McCartney's answer exists in the only language that was ever going to be enough.